Hello, hello, hello. My name is Shonda Carter, and you are here for a very, very special Facebook Live. As you can see by the picture, we have some things going on in our world once again. And today I have a very special guest, Officer Kaisha Zelby. Do you like to have the hyphenated version of your name? I don't want to, which version do you like of your name?
Zedley is just fine.
Beverly is just fine. She is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful person that I met along my journey of my God-given journey. We clashed, not clashed, we ran into each other so many years ago that I can't even count. I get embarrassed now thinking about how many years it's been because it's like, am I that old? But anyway, tonight is a very serious topic. And we are here talking about, I'm calling it social justice because that, does the full ensemble of what we're talking about. My very good friend Kaisha, she is a police officer. She is a female police officer. If you are watching this, you can see that she is an African-American Black female police officer. And I just felt that her voice is the perfect voice that we needed tonight for this broadcast. So I just want to thank her in advance for this wonderful time that she has given to us. Right now, police officers are not too popular, correct?
Very true. Very true. Yep.
So I do thank you for your courage to come on, which leads us into kind of your mission, which is you have a podcast called Courage Beyond the Badge. So you are every time I get on CNN or my husband's watching CNN and something like this comes up, I think of, oh my gosh, she would be so good on that because you're walking the walk and you're talking the talk. And I just once again thank you so much. So I'm going to stop talking. You guys get your questions ready, put them in the comments. She has said she's here to help us. She said she's here to answer questions. So let's get it going. Kaisha, what was your take when you saw that video that has taken over our lives at this moment? And we're talking about you go ahead.
So for anyone who has potentially, unfamiliar with the photo that you had there before you and I began speaking, obviously we're talking about an individual by the name of George Floyd who was killed in Minnesota by a Minneapolis police officer who was effecting an arrest and during so used a tactic on him and it resulted in his death. And so that's what brings us to this conversation. This combined with, I think a lot of emotion that is driving folks right now because we feel like here's yet another instance of someone who is being treated inhumanely by someone who is operating under the color of authority of a police officer. And, they lose their life in a way that seems so tragic and senseless. And in this instance, I feel like totally barbaric. Yesterday, I made a Facebook post that got a little bit of energy and stirred up some conversation. Sometimes I find myself like I like to be a connector and I like to be a bridge builder. I like to seek solutions rather than just get on social media and spew frustration and anger at a situation. But the only way that we stop seeing the George Floyds of the world, the Breonna Taylors, and the names go on, is that we seek out solutions. And so sometimes I'm a little provocative. I like to show kind of the other side, especially having 20 years in law enforcement and kind of knowing the narrative that starts to build when there's a use of force situation. And so yesterday, I did a little research that was sparked by another friend who had posted Minneapolis Police Department's use of force protocol, their procedures. Mm-hmm. And some departments call them directives, some of them call them SOP, standard operating procedures. However, while reading those use of force policies, it became very clear to me that Minneapolis has some pretty outdated and unconscionable policies on their books that very well may have led to these officers thinking they were operating within the guidelines of a policy, which seems unbelievable.
Yes.
But when I'm going to just read a little bit of what's listed in our policies and what's allowed as far as the use of force goes. So, what we saw there was not a legitimate defensive tactic, but if you want to call it that, it looks like their policy might refer to that as some sort of neck restraint or conscious neck restraint. And in section 5-311 of their protocol, it states that a conscious neck restraint can be used when the subject is placed in a neck restraint with intent to control and not to render the subject unconscious, but only by applying light to immediate pressure. Well, then it goes on to add that there are two other authorized types of neck restraints, one including an unconscious neck restraint. And the justification for utilizing one of these neck restraints is including on a subject who is exhibiting active resistance in order to gain control of the subject, and if lesser attempts at control have been or would likely be ineffective. And that's the kind of language that I want to draw attention to folks who are thinking, what can we do? How can we respond when things like this are happening? In your individual cities and communities, each police department, whether it's a local municipality or if you live in a rural area that is covered by state police, they all operate under some sort of directive or procedure. And if there is a procedure on the books in your police department that is as broad to state that if lesser attempts of control have been or would likely be ineffective, that is such a vague catch-all that will give an officer that has a malintent in their heart to begin with, because you can't do what that officer did and have started your job and be on the police force for the right intentions and have the right intentions in mind. But if you have that kind of an officer on your force and you have this kind of a policy on your books, it gives them sort of this open-ended invitation to treat someone as inhumanely and within the confines of a use of force policy that is far too broad. So that's an area that folks, that are looking to say, what can I do in my local community? How can I address issues? Take a look at what should be publicly available use of force procedures and standards in your community. That would be one of the very first places that I would say to start. So
that's a really good place to start. You might need your headphones now. What happens, but that's a really good place to start. That was like one of the first questions. Like, it might seem so little what you can do. However, it is something that you can do. When you were reading that, I was like, she is well trained. Like you said, you've had 20 years on the police force, so you know what to look for, and you know that that's broad. What should someone? I was a former probation parole officer, so I've had police training. I only lasted a year. I couldn't do it, so I give all honor to you. And we do have to. A lot of things, there's a lot of anger on Facebook right now, against all cops. And they're saying, well, where were the good cops when they were standing around where were the good cops when this was happening? Because, we don't want to go into an all or nothing mode where we just, believe that all police officers are bad. Like I said, I'm given the privilege of not doing that because I know you. I've known a few others that have been brave, but there is that I would like for you to talk about, if you don't mind, what was going through those other officers' heads? I know you don't know that, but what do you think was going on when this was happening? The crowd was shouting. I've heard the video described. It's horrible. It's evil. It's gut wrenching. What type of environment does there have to be to where three others sworn to protect and serve can stand around and watch something like that?
You know, Shonda, can you hear me okay now on the mic? Okay. So, Shonda, that's a question that I keep asking myself over and over. And I know a lot of my fellow officers ask themselves as well. And for folks who have seen the video, you see the one officer who is standing looking on, but there's another view, a photo from another surveillance camera that shows the other side of the vehicle, which a lot of people who haven't seen, which shows two other officers sort of crouched down on the side of George Floyd. So they're all in very clear view of what's happening. And my first thought, before I had seen the entire video, I thought perhaps, the other officers were consumed with crowd control, that they were unaware of exactly what was happening. But for 5 to 8 minutes, that's kind of hard to even excuse. But I thought perhaps their attention was turned away from the officer that was actually engaged physically with the subject. But as it turns out, they all had their attention turned directly to the individual and the officer who had his knee on his neck. Mm-hmm. And of course, I wasn't there. And I don't want to speculate exactly what they were thinking, but I can certainly say that in law enforcement, and as you know from your time being in a law enforcement position, there is a culture that exists that doesn't make it easy for someone to speak up in a time when they see wrongdoing happening.
Yes.
It's its own sort of cloud that hangs over the profession that says we're all in this together and we all will go down together, or we'll stick together, we'll formulate the same story. And if anyone who's a fellow officer is watching this and is disagreeing with what I'm saying, you're fooling yourself. Mm-hmm. And if you are that officer who has a hard time speaking up when you see something that's wrong, it doesn't have to be nearly as egregious of what occurred to George Floyd, but something as simple as someone berating someone on the street when it's just uncalled for. The incident has now quelled, it's subsided. It's time for maybe the number of officers that are gathered around to now decrease. The threat has been removed. Speak up. Even if you are just an officer, a newer officer, there's a tactful way to do it. Even if you think that it might cause more problems if you speak up, you could go pull the officer aside, or you may have to very actively say, okay, this is enough. We're done. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You have to speak up. That badge that you have pinned on your chest is not about being silent in the face of wrongdoing. Mm-hmm. If you're going to pin that badge on your chest, have the courage to speak up when you see that something wrong is happening. And in that moment, those three officers, they didn't exhibit that courage at all. Mm-hmm. They exhibited cowardice, they exhibited malice, and they exhibited intent, in my opinion.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad you brought that up, because we did discuss previously, I am going to tell on myself. Like you said, I've had previous law enforcement training and I worked in the area of corrections, and I've had to have that conversation of there are some things that I saw that I did not speak up about, because you're putting your life, and do not get this confused with I'm condoning anything as far as that goes. I've had the luxury of years to look at this and go, you know what? I was wrong. I was 10 years younger. I'm not going to blame that on my age. No one died. But like you said, it's the small things that I knew were wrong and I pretended not to see. because in that culture that you spoke about, it was us against them.
Hmm.
And you have to put your life in your your partner's hands, and you don't want to be labeled as that's a snitch. Like I said, it does not condone it. You are being so courageous and speaking to your fellow officers, and not that you're not a Christian, but I'm here to speak to my fellow Christians of the same thing goes for you. You know what I'm saying? It's we're called, like, we use the excuse, some of us use the excuse of we're in this world, not of it. What are we here for if not to make it better? There's no purpose of us being here if not to make it better. And pretending like things like this are not happening and sticking your head in the sand and going, well, let's just talk about faith, or giving the directive to just pray. No, I want some what do we do type of action. And I want some of these we need to discuss, because it is a culture, like you were saying, it is a culture that this is, oh, I did not want to watch that video. I saw it. It's like, oh, and I'm embarrassedly saying, here we go again. Well, there's nothing I can do. And I just continued on with business as usual until I could not continue with business as usual. I was
Hmm.
talking about things, and I love the Lord. But what I was talking about today was like, God, this ain't it. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, God, this ain't it. I can't keep doing. And he said, he never told us to do that. That's the problem. It's like, I'm, I'm brave and wild enough to say, I said a prayer for the family. That can't be it. There's got to be something else that I can do. And that's when I picked up the phone, and fear and trepidation decided, and I called you up like, please, please, please. And I do thank you for coming on, because we have some really good guests that are with you 100%. I was kind of worried that we were going to get some people that want to say some negative things because of you do carry a badge. So I'm really grateful. We are in this together. We are, me having the luxury of having a job as a newscaster, because my husband's like, would we be talking about this if this wasn't on video? And I'm like, absolutely not. We would not be talking about this. Number one, the news, when I worked for the news, it was like, if you don't have video, it don't make it to your show, because we got to have something, to
Yeah.
titillate, to be honest.
Hmm.
And that was horrific. Watching that was horrific. I never wanted.
Yeah. It was hard to watch, and I like you, resisted watching it for a while because you just figure, I've seen enough of these. Eric Garner. Every time I think of him, that audio just plays over and over in my head, and it's hard to have that image. You try to avoid it.
Yes. And that's been the problem with people trying to avoid it, and trying to avoid it by not talking about it is what is causing the problem to grow. I know when I was doing the work with human trafficking victims, no one wanted to talk about it. No one wanted to believe that it was here in, our sleepy town. People want a victim bash and victim shame. And, when we see things like this, it's, well, if he would have just complied, or he must have been resisting arrest.
Was
They,
he on drugs?
yes,
Mhm.
and, heaven forbid we get the autopsy report and, oh, there you go. Heaven forbid that, there is something in his system, because it takes on a whole different direction. And it's just, I remember there was a quote that said, we slowly rewrite history to keep it from being uncomfortable.
Mm.
And I didn't say it all the way right, but that was the gist of it. It's like we're making these excuses to just avoid it instead of doing the hard work to change. And that's why I wanted you on tonight so much. And Angie Rice says, I watched it, but it was absolutely horrific and heartbreaking. Uh, Gia Sullivan says, I couldn't watch the video. Seeing the pics were horrific already. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Were you worried about like you said, we've seen this. Here we go again. We've seen this time and time again. Where do you even get, like, what goes through your mind when these videos come out? Like, what are you worried? Are you in fear? Are you like more cautious when you go back out to do your job? What happens to the police force when stuff like this comes out? Because there are some good officers out there.
Yeah. So what those of us who are out there doing the right thing, which obviously is the overwhelming majority of folks that are on law enforcement that are operating, you know, behind the badge, that got into the job for the right reasons and continue to do the right thing. Um, what we know is the fallout of situations like this is there's violence that gets turned towards the police officers, and there's even further distrust, and it further drives the divide between the law enforcement community and the communities that we serve. And you know, I go back to, you know, what I was saying earlier about just speaking to people and treating them inhumanely when you're on the street and having an interaction with them. I try to remind officers that work with me that that interaction that you just had, that negative interaction that you just that we had with an individual, the next officer that encounters that individual could potentially pay for that. Their you know, some other individual who encounter some other officer who encounters that individual, or a family member who they have relayed their interaction with the police to. Um, and you know, we have so much authority. We have so much authority just by our mere presence. You know, that old force continuum, and how the very first rung of the force continuum is officer presence. Just our office, just our presence alone creates a it creates a intention to have a certain action happen, whether it's for a fight that's in progress to stop, for a disturbance, or whatever it is. Like, that is on our use of force continuum, just our presence. And it's so important that we take the authority that comes with just our mere presence and understand how that could be, can inflict terror in people who have been negatively, who have had negative encounters by the police before. We can't predict that, we can't project that, but you have to acknowledge that there are people out there who have had some pretty bad experiences with the police in the past. And just our mere presence, like, sometimes we'll come up to a situation, we might just be walking into the deli to get something to eat, and just our mere presence, is like, oh, the cops are here, what's going on? But don't necessarily disregard that person's feeling of angst by your mere presence. Don't forget that our mere presence is intended to create that response. And don't forget that our mere presence may drum up some previous trauma that they or a family member has had. I tell this story sometimes about an individual that that I and some other officers encountered, who was suspected of shoplifting. He was an older individual, and when we went to stop him to investigate the suspected retail theft, he was kind of cornered at the entrance of the store, and he got super scared, like, right away. And you know, some of the officers are like, "Well, what are you scared for? If you didn't do anything, what are you so afraid for?" And he was so visibly fearful. He began taking things off of him that was suspected to be stolen. There was, like, food items. This grocery store sold hot prepared food items. and they were packaged. So he had packaged food items and other like personal care items. The individual was obviously either homeless or otherwise
Mhm.
in a desperate situation. It doesn't exclude the fact that he was committing a crime at all. But he was obviously stealing things that he was utilizing for personal use.
Mhm.
And as he was pulling these things out, he started like crying. And it seemed so trivial and so kind of like ridiculous, maybe, to someone who didn't have sensitivity to the fact that that individual at some point has seen or had his own bad encounter.
Mhm.
And as we continue to encounter this male, he eventually urinated on himself, he defecated on himself, and he was so terrified as he's crying, he had dentures and they fell out of his mouth. It felt like, like the most sort of dehumanizing
Right.
instance of an individual. Sure, we're there doing our job, but there's a compassionate way to
Mm.
do anything that you do. And there's a way to acknowledge this person is fearful for a reason that has much more to do than this sort of simple interaction that we're having with them right now. And we got to be able to see the humanity in people. We have to be able to see that people out there are lots of people who are, committing crime, sort of just ravaging their communities. I get that. But there's folks that are just trying to live life the same that we are, trying to provide for their families the same that we are. And we have to see humanity in people, in each other, so that we're not out forgetting the reason why we pin that badge on us.
I love that. I thank you for sharing that story because bringing the humanity in it. I was watching the newscast, the special report where, they said that they're not able to bring up the charges quite yet. They did say, when I say they, the Justice Department, the federal investigation that's going on. And they said they want to be very careful as far as this goes. And they wanted people to, we respect your right to protest, but they wanted to do it peacefully. And I was just thinking my heart aches because there's been so many years that there's been, with them saying no charges, it started to rile up. This is like right before we got on. It's just people not be, the officers. The main thing that kept going was if it was you or me on that, well, not you, you have a badge. If it was me on that video doing those type of things, immediately I would have been arrested. And I know you went over the use of force, and that's the policies of the use of force, and that's exactly what. And I got some questions here, so I'm going to wrap it up because I do have some questions over here on the side. The That the officers are not being held accountable, that they're supposed to be at a higher standard, and yet they're getting away with it. Looks like they're getting away with it. And that people are not being heard. So I appreciate that you are one of those people that are trying to hear, trying to listen, and trying to help your fellow officers to hear as well. And that's where the courage beyond the badge comes in, I'm sure, correct? Okay.
Absolutely.
And I want you to, like I said, I want to get to these questions, but I want you to end with you telling us about what you're doing, because one of the first questions we have is, so what can we do or stop these killings from happening? We have to hold these officers accountable and at a higher standard. My answer, I don't know if anybody wants it, but my same answer is like the first thing you got to do is vote. I know Gia, and I know she votes. So after you voted, after you have made your voice known, you have said, go and get the policies, start reviewing the policies. What do we do after that? Who do we talk to about these policies to change these policies? Who do we talk to after that?
Well, a lot of these instances where we see there either being no charges or the district attorney in the particular community, they will defer to a grand jury, which oftentimes ends up, we've seen that sort of going in the favor of what seems like the officers all the time, and or let me rephrase that. It seems like the grand jury gives a much higher burden on the,
Mhm.
you know, right,
Proving the officers wrong. Plus, just for
right.
the grand jury, they only get what the district attorney gives them. Is that correct? Still, okay.
That's yeah,
So yeah, that's so the district attorney presents to them what they want the grand jury to see.
right.
Here.
And here's the thing: there should be more of a standard when it comes to um, use of force incidents that result in where there's an investigation and there's concern that there may have been wrongdoing during this use of force. What a lot of people may not realize is that in communities, smaller communities especially, the district attorney's office and their local police departments, they work very closely together. And it's oftentimes a really positive relationship, and there's a place for that. It's important that there is harmony between the district attorney's office and the police departments that they work alongside. But when it comes down to investigating those same police departments, then there may sometimes become an inability to be as impartial as is necessary. And I say this knowing how good of a relationship there's been in the past, in the community where I've worked, and how close that relationship is with the district attorney's office. And they're professionals, and it's not to take anything from their ability to otherwise um, execute the law as it should be. But when it comes to an investigation with a law enforcement agency, I think there ought to be an impartial agency that is investigating that. And that's another area that folks can sort of demand change. You shouldn't have folks that are an officer's friend to be investigating their potential wrongdoing.
Absolutely.
It should just simply be impartial. And that's to exonerate an officer who has been involved in a use of force situation where they absolutely use correct judgment. They operated within the confines of the law, which again is almost always the case. But the times that it is not, we can't have that ever. We have too much authority
Mm.
to abuse that authority. I remind folks all the time that we have the ability to take someone's freedom and, God forbid, take their life.
Wow.
And to whom much is given, much is required.
Wow. You
So,
said.
with that degree of authority, we've got to have a higher level of accountability, transparency when it comes to that accountability, and impartiality when it comes to that accountability. And I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No. Oh no. I mean, that was so powerful. Like I'm almost speechless. Like you're like to hear you say it. It's different. Like you said, it is courage beyond the badge. To hear you say that, it's more than just saying, "Hey, they can't be doing this." It's so much more powerful to hear you say it. Your voice is so needed in this time. We have. I'm going to have to make this my final question. I'm sorry we could go on and on about this forever, and that is the purpose. If you want to go on and keep having these conversations, you can contact Miss Kaisha Zebli and talk to her on her podcast, Courage Beyond the Badge. But I want to end in this question. It's kind of a hard one. But I also want to thank Miss Angie Rice for her comments. She said, exactly, always the question, what's the rest of the story? What did he do? There has to be more to it, as if somehow he deserves such a fate. I agree with you on that, Angie. Absolutely. I'm sick of that narrative. I'm sick of people waiting to call wrong until, yeah, you need to get the whole story. We don't want to jump off the bridge, but let's come on, let's get it together, people. And so my final question is: do you think the culture of the police department is so that most people of color have had a negative experience with the police by the age of 30? What are your thoughts?
Gosh, Mr. Carter, you know, I think that most people of color, if I polled, I have a group chat with my family, and um, there's probably like 20 of us between my brothers, nieces, and nephews. And if I polled just that small segment, I think that almost every one of them would say that they've had some sort of negative encounter with the police. And that could range anywhere from being stopped in a neighborhood. There's all sorts of legitimate reasons why we can pull people over. But maybe you're in a neighborhood that police officers not so certain that you belong in, and so they're looking for a reason to pull you, legitimate reason to pull you over to find out exactly why you're in that neighborhood.
Mhm.
And I know that's happened to me. Um, it's happened to me when I was out canvassing for a political candidate, and my interaction with the police was not so positive. And I say often to folks, I have something on my side. If all
Mhm.
else fails, if all else fails, I can say, officer, I'm I'm a police officer, blah blah blah. I can kind of give that caveat,
I'm so glad you're being honest about that. Thank you so
I
much.
could give that caveat, and then it might sort of lessen or lower the tension or something, you know. Um, but I know that my nieces and nephews, my brothers, I know they don't have that same ability.
Mhm.
I know they don't have that same kind of little extra thing that if things start to kind of go sideways, they can throw that in there. Uh, so to answer Mr. Carter's question, I would say, unfortunately, I think if I polled my family and asked them have how many of them have had a negative interact besides the ones that I don't already know, because I know ones who have,
Mhm.
if they've had a negative encounter with the police, whether it just be, like I said, a car stop that maybe had a deeper intention, um, I'd say there's a good portion that would say yes.
Yes. Well, oh my gosh. Like I said, we planned for 30 minutes. As you can see, I don't even want to stop now, but I do thank you for your time and I don't want to take advantage of that. What I do want to uh sometimes when you were saying that, I remember calling my I was so upset I got arrested. Oh, heaven forbid, yes, I got arrested.
We never talked about that, Miss Shonda.
That was it was like so like 50,000 years ago. I was in I got arrested for something really stupid and I was so devastated. And they treated me so bad because I wanted to be a police officer till that experience because I was treated so ridiculously. Like I think, oh, yeah, we'll talk about it later because I don't want to get too much into the details. But it was such a stupid charge, and it was like they went overboard to make it a big deal, and it really did affect my thing. But one of the things that I laugh about is I called, I think my uncle, and I was like, oh, I'm snot crying, like I got arrested. He's like, you're 20 years old, that's your first time, and I'm like, you guys are criminals. They were like, about like that's like an everyday thing here. So I'm not making light of the situation, but I don't like to leave on such. This is such a heavy subject, and the reason why we wanted to discuss social justice is because it is not just the police officer's job. You heard Kaisha talk about it's a culture. I'm so glad that she brought that up. She's trying to change the culture where she is. Christians, if we're going to do all this big talk and this big mandate about we're world changers, we can't be changing the world to get a Cadillac. You know what I'm saying? We got to be changing the world. Social justice is a stream of compassion. Jesus had compassion for people. It is not compassionate to watch a video like that and say, like, well, I'll wait for the rest of the story. It is not compassionate to, you know, say they probably deserved it, or some of the other horrific things that are being told on social media. And I don't know if they're Christians or not, but it's not. about Christianity. It's about being a human being. And that is what, love God, you love your neighbor as you love yourself means. Being compassionate, being able to step into someone else's shoes. You would not like to see your child on the street like that. You would not like to see your neighbor, anyone you know, on the street like that. And you would not stand by and go, well, we'd have to see what he did. That would cause an immediate reaction. And thank God, to the majority of us, it did cause a reaction to let us know that we're still human. And Kaisha has just touched the tip of the iceberg of what you can start to do about it. Because I'm not going to put her in an unfair position to say, what are we going to do about this? She's one person. We have to do this together. So I'm going to end with those thoughts. You have so much love over here in the comments. I hope you take the time to go back and read the comments. You have a lot of love here.
Thank
I
you.
am in awe of your courage, and I have put your podcast in the chat. So you better come up and you better have some episodes, lady, because you got some fan club already. So I'm going to wish you much love. I'm going to thank you so much. And I have got to go talk about some other things. And I just want to say I love you. I appreciate your courage. I am in such honor and respect of you more than ever for doing this. And I just thank you immensely. Words cannot express. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shonda, and I love you too. So grateful that we had this conversation and look forward to carrying it on. Let's do something.
Absolutely. If we need a part two as it progresses, I'm down for a part two. How about you?
I'm down.
All right.
All right.
Y'all, if you want a part two, and you guys get your questions ready, what you want to ask her, because I got my view. Y'all got your view. Let's make this a whole conversation. All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.